Today from the global lane, China, Turkey, and the EU. Tariffs, trade disputes, and sanctions. Why now? What are the goals? Is an end in sight? Jobs, jobs, and more jobs. It's a good time to be looking for work in America. Where should you start? Ill-informed college students on campus. Can you name your First Amendment rights? And I'll drive it home on what Americans really think about Robert Mueller's Russia investigation. And it's all right here, right now, from the global lane. President Trump has imposed a 25% tariff on an additional $16 billion worth of Chinese products entering the United States. The products include motorcycles, speedometers, resins, and multimeters. In July, the U.S. placed a 25% tariff on $34 billion worth of Chinese imports. Now, the president says he wants fair treatment for U.S. products and for China to play by international trade rules. China has responded by imposing tariffs of its own on U.S. agricultural goods and other products. Well, joining us from our Washington studio with some insights is Chris Garcia. Mr. Garcia is the former National Acting Director of Minority Business Development at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Chris, so many conservatives and libertarians are concerned about the president's approach. They say U.S. policy should embrace zero tariffs and free trade. Could this be the start of a trade war with China? What do you think?
So many would say that we're already in a war. That's really, frankly, a bit of an exaggeration. What we're seeing is an approach by the president and by his trade advisors to try to level the playing field with China. It's very important to remember that China has been taking advantage of the United States for decades. President Trump's the first president to take a step in the direction of getting them to the table with the utilization of tariffs that will hurt their economy in a fashion that would bring them back to the table and get them to stop the unfair theft of IP, the unfair non-tariff barriers, and of course the subsidization of their goods that they sell here to the United States. So all the president's doing here is looking for an equal, level playing field. He wants fair and reciprocal trade, and I think it's going to be pretty close to the breaking point for China with their economy doing as poorly as it is and with our economy as strong as it is.
So how do we get China to play by the rules when they've never really played by the rules before?
Right. So what we've seen is that in the past, administrations have just thrown their hands in the air and they've said, well, I guess that's how it's going to be. We're just going to have things made in China from now on. And unfortunately, that's sold the American worker out. And so the president's taking a very unconventional approach in utilizing what many would consider to be not a very conservative or libertarian free market approach in imposing tariffs. But these tariffs are putting a significant strain on the Chinese right now. And right now what we're going to need to see is China make the move. They know exactly what our demands are. We want no tariffs. We want no non-tariff barriers. And we want no subsidies. China knows what we want, and it's their move right now. The ball's in their court.
Well, it seems this tit for tat could keep going on and on and on. Trump imposes new tariffs. China reciprocates. What are the chances the president may be acting on impulse, Chris, without thinking about the impact on American farmers, workers, and the economy? That's what some of the critics are saying.
Well, the president fully understands the impact, the short-term pain that's going to result from this. His trade advisors are also aware of that. And frankly, farmers and workers in America and American companies, manufacturers here also understand that. But if you take a look at some of the polling numbers, you take a look at some of these survey results of some of these small businesses, some of these manufacturers, and even some of these farmers, what you're finding is that they're still supportive of the president. They know what the president's trying to do. They understand his strategy. Remember, these are folks that have been taken advantage of unfairly for decades.
I guess it's already working with steel. The tariffs on steel are having an effect with U.S. Steel opening some more plants, and I know hiring 500 more workers in Illinois. So President Trump has received a lot of criticism from the media, especially in Brussels when he challenged the European Union on tariffs, especially German automobiles. It seems the EU is kind of backing down a bit, but the president suggests the Europeans haven't really acted like friends. So what do you see happening with Europe?
Well, the president's opponents are always going to detract from the successes that the president achieves, especially with our allies, and even with bringing some of our adversaries to the table to try to make peace. So what happened, we saw the European Commission President, John Paul Juncker, come to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Trump at the White House. He came to make a deal because he knew that the president was serious about these renegotiations. What happens is when the United States wants to sell a car to the European Union, they're charged a 10% tax on that car, which drives the price of that vehicle up and drives demand down. Conversely, if we want to buy a German-made car, for example, there's only a 2.5% tariff that we impose on those vehicles, which again is not a very fair. 10% versus 2.5% is not a very fair deal. So the president is saying we'd like to drop the tariffs altogether. What we saw as a result of that meeting is that they're going to increase, that they're going to work toward, first of all, number one, they're going to work toward dropping tariffs altogether. Number two, they're going to increase the purchase of liquid natural gas, the purchase of soybeans, the purchase of beef from the United States. So we're going to boost our exports. And then thirdly, what we saw was a joint agreement to work toward reforming the World Trade Organization and those guidelines. And the United States, the biggest takeaway from this meeting was that the United States and the European Union are now working in concert, are working in unison to combat China's unfair trade practices. So we've got to take a look at the big picture strategy.
Well, it looks like maybe in the long term the trade imbalance will be reduced then. Now, moving on to another issue, sanctions. We've seen that sanctions don't really work well when other countries refuse to join in. There's been multilateral action against North Korea. That seems to be working, at least for now. But with new sanctions against Iran, Chris, it seems the U.S. stands alone. So how will our policy be effective if our allies continue to do business with the Ayatollah?
Well, so ultimately, these economic sanctions that we're placing on Iran have to do, again, with the very, very poorly negotiated Iran nuclear deal, which temporarily put off some of their nuclear capabilities, but it didn't address their conventional ballistic missile capabilities. And what we saw as a result of this Iran deal is you had an influx of capital because of the relaxing of sanctions in 2016. And Iran didn't stop their activity, didn't curb their activity. They actually increased their regional militias. And this is a huge threat to our allies like Israel. So as we fast forward to just this recent last week, these economic sanctions that we're imposing on Iran are as a result of the desire for Iran to continue to attack Israel, to continue to attack America, to continue to chant these death to America, death to Israel, and this regime to have that position. And so what we're going to see is private businesses have a choice now between whether they want to do business with Iran or whether they want to do business with the United States.
And the president just imposed some additional economic sanctions on Russia because of its use of poison chemicals against a former Russian spy and his daughter in Britain. Your thoughts on that, Chris?
Well, we have to take action, and this is certainly not an unprecedented move by the United States. Anytime we see an adversary using chemical warfare against private citizens, using chemical warfare, period, that's against international law. And so the United States has both legal standing and, frankly, moral standing to impose these sanctions against Russia. And that just further solidifies the United States' strong posture against Russian aggression, whether that's the aggression in Ukraine. The president has decided to go ahead and arm Ukraine in its fight against Russia, or whether it's imposing sanctions as a result of these nerve gas attacks against this former Russian spy and his daughter, which was a very tragic occasion. And what happened there as a result was we expelled 100 Russian diplomats from the United States, and we even closed down the Seattle embassy, the Russian embassy in Seattle. So the president's been very strong. It's a necessary step in order, and these sanctions are being imposed to make sure that Russia will concede the fact and admit the fact that they did in fact use these nerve agents, chemical weapons, and to make sure that they promise not to use chemical weapons ever again in the future.
Well, I guess a lot of the supporters of the president would say it doesn't look like collusion to me with the Russians when you do things like that. So, okay, Chris Garcia, former National Acting Director of Minority Business Development at the Department of Commerce, we thank you for joining us from Washington.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
When the July jobs numbers came in, they provided more good news for the U.S. economy. Unemployment now stands at 3.9%. 4% is considered full employment because people are always in between jobs. What it means is that anyone who really wants a job in the U.S. can likely find one. Well, joining us with more is Alfredo Ortiz. Mr. Ortiz is the CEO of Job Creators Network. First, Mr. Ortiz, what did you think of the latest jobs numbers?
Gary, I have to tell you, first of all, thank you for having me. We couldn't be more excited as Job Creators Network. Optimism is at the highest levels ever, and the 3.9% unemployment shows that the tax cuts are working for the American public and for our businesses, whether you're a small business, medium business, or a large business. It's working, and we're excited to see these numbers that we are. And by the way, these are historic lows across every single demographic, whether it's white, black, Hispanic, Asian. These numbers are working for everyone.
Now, critics say the numbers were disappointing because only 157,000 new jobs were added. Why the slowdown? Are they onto something there?
Well, no. I mean, what we're seeing is really, for the first time also in history, we're seeing that there are more jobs available than there are actually people to fill them. The biggest thing that we're seeing is that there now is really a skills gap, and I think that's what's actually coming down here. There was never really a wage gap in this country really, but there was really a skills gap, and I think that's what employers are starting to see. But the good news is there's a term called the U6 unemployment rate. That was actually really, really critical because that picks up, first of all, people who are frustrated, who stopped looking for jobs or were part-time that wanted full-time jobs, and those are actually looking much, much better. Those rates are really low, which means that more of the people who normally traditionally were kind of on the sidelines, they're coming back into the labor force, and we're really excited to see that.
Well, where are most of the new jobs being created right now? What sector of the economy?
Yeah, that's a great thing. You know, that's also another exciting thing that we're seeing. We're seeing that growth in the sectors that, frankly, the previous administration and the Obama administration, they said those jobs were gone. These are manufacturing jobs, construction jobs, mining jobs. There are about 1 million of those jobs were formed. And so we're really excited. I mean, when you look at that kind of job growth, 3.5 million new jobs created really since President Trump took office. And these are the jobs, 1 million or so jobs that, frankly, the previous administration, again, President Obama said those jobs were gone. We're excited to see those back because these are hard-working, middle-class American-type jobs that, frankly, we need more of in this country.
And where specifically in the country, what states are we seeing the biggest growth?
You know, the exciting thing is we're seeing growth, for example, in West Virginia. I was actually at a stop with the vice president just a couple of weeks ago in Wheeling, West Virginia. That optimism was sky high. The room full of people, they were excited about the jobs coming back. We're talking coal, we're talking steel. Again, a lot of jobs that were previously thought to have been almost non-existent in this country, those are all coming back. And of course, construction is at an all-time high. And business investment is at an 8% growth rate versus previous year. That's incredible. We hadn't seen those kinds of rates in reinvestment in business in a very, very long time.
And it seems that people are more optimistic now about jobs and the economy. Now,
that's right.
Now, tightened borders and this crackdown on illegal immigrants, is that good for employers or does it create a void in the workforce?
You know, I know a lot of folks say that there is a void in the workforce because of that, but, you know, at the end, we need to work on border security. It's extremely important, not really only just from an immigration standpoint, but really in terms of the whole opioid crisis and what that's doing to our country today. That is a true, really attack within our borders that's coming from the Chinese, across the board, and that's really hurting our American workforce. A lot of my members who are employers, small or medium-sized employers, they're saying that part of the biggest problem that they're having issues with trying to find good employees that are qualified is actually those that actually pass a drug test. And so this is very concerning. We really got to address that issue, and I think border security is one of the primary ways of doing that.
Now, what about the argument that immigrants take jobs that most Americans don't want, like farm work, other lower-paying manual labor jobs?
I mean, right now, what we know is that there are more jobs available than there are people to fill them. So, frankly, from an American workforce, we know that there are jobs available for every single person that actually wants a job. So, we usually don't try to get into, issues related to that. But I will tell you that right now, there are people out there ready to fill these jobs. But we do have to make sure that they've got the right skill sets. And I think one of the recent things that President Trump just announced through the Department of Labor, working with Ivanka Trump, is basically an opportunity for people today to have those skill sets. I mean, unfortunately, Gary, over the past several years, especially under the Obama administration, over $1 trillion was put behind student debt for people to go, our youth of today got into this debt because they were told that the only way you can be successful in this country is if you have, an advanced degree. I love advanced degrees. I have an advanced degree, but I will tell you there are a lot of people out there who don't want them, don't need them, and would be very, very happy having a great, paying job as an HVAC technician or a plumber making $65,000 a year with no debt. And we've got to make sure people understand that.
A lot of great trade schools out there.
Oh, yeah.
And what do you expect might happen then, finally, wrapping this up? What may happen in the months ahead? Continued growth and expansion, or do you think things will start cooling down a bit?
I think we're going to continue to see great growth. I mean, the one thing that we're doing, this is not a one-time kind of thing where you're boosting the economy with some kind of, an infusion of cash into the economy. This is basically an overall shift in the way we view the economy, in the way we view regulations. I mean, our small business owners used to tell us that over-regulation, over-taxation, and the lack of access to capital and credit were the three main things that were keeping them behind. The president and this administration has tackled all three of those. We're very excited to see it. So we're going to continue to see that growth because the environment has changed. But I will tell you, in November, what is at stake is the prosperity that we are seeing today, or the lack of prosperity that we saw in the 8 years under the Obama administration.
Well, I think many Americans are hoping this fall they'll get a few more crumbs, as Nancy Pelosi refers to tax cuts.
That's right. That's
okay,
right. That's
Alfredo Ortiz, CEO of Job Creators Network, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Can you name your First Amendment rights, those guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution? They're a central part of what we believe as Americans, yet an astonishing poll of students shows many struggle to name a single First Amendment right. Well, joining us is Campus Reform Leadership Institute correspondent Zachary Petrozo. Zachary, so who were these students, and what did they say when asked about the First Amendment?
These students at Columbia University were asked by our media director here, Cabot Phillips, about what is exactly those protections underneath our First Amendment. The responses were quite shocking. Students came back and spoke about how they weren't exactly sure about what those protections were when they are what we, every single day as Americans, hold dear and protect us from that of a government.
I've got $20 right here if you can name all five.
No way I'm naming all five.
Any come to mind, freedoms under the First Amendment?
Yo, I have no idea.
Can you name the 5 freedoms protected under the First Amendment?
No, I definitely can't. I don't know.
Nah, I can't.
Yeah, any?
I mean, we can guess. Under the First Amendment. Nah.
How long do I have? Press.
Yep.
Free speech. Right to bear arms, is that a different amendment? I think that's a different amendment.
That's the Second Amendment.
Okay, yeah, there you go.
Now I feel like I need to go home and just read.
The right to a jury by your peers?
No.
Then I'm done.
How widespread do you think this lack of knowledge is, Zachary, and why?
I think it's ultimately becoming a larger trend on college campuses. Instead of colleges teaching important classes such as government and politics and mathematics and things like this, colleges are tending to teach more social justice related classes that don't have those core foundations in which students need to succeed in the real world.
And they're not getting it in high school either, obviously.
No.
Wow, whatever happened to high school civics?
You got that. And at the Leadership Institute's Campus Reform, we actually have done some more reporting on similar stories where students aren't taking those types of courses and instead taking these so-called social justice classes, which include classes, such geared towards, equality and things of this nature, where that might be important, but these core classes like economics are traditionally what we need to succeed in fields like business and math and mathematics and even if you want to become a doctor, lawyer, things of that nature.
Well, sometimes it's just great to have that general knowledge. So what effect does this have, not knowing your First Amendment rights and other details of the Constitution, have on campus and on society as a whole?
It's extremely dangerous. It's extremely dangerous to not know the rights in which protect you, such as freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, right? I mean, too often on college campuses, we see that other students are suppressing other students' speech. Traditionally speaking, at the Leadership Institute's campus reform, we've reported on numerous ways in which left-leaning students, whether that be Antifa or other groups like that, are ultimately violent towards that of conservative thought. At UCLA, they had a civil dialogue panel in which they spoke about different ideas, right? And there was a group of students that actually marched in to disrupt a civil dialogue panel and started yelling, no Trump, no KKK, no Nazis, right? But that's not truly what discourse is. And I think on our college campuses across the country, we need to start having true, honest conversations instead of trying to shut down conservatives, saying that, their hate speech or their full rhetoric, people have to come to understand, administrators and other students have to come to and understand that conservatives might have okay ideas, right?
Yeah, there seems like there's a lack of debate, not allowing varied opinions. Also, I understand there's a growing trend for conservative students to self-censor speech because they fear bad grades or negative reactions from their liberal professors. So tell us about that.
Absolutely. Recently, on the Leadership Institute's campus reform site, Professor Wills at Queen's University did a study in which showed and confirmed what we've been reporting on for years here at the Leadership Institute's campus reform. It showed that students are ultimately self-censoring. As a conservative student myself and outspoken, I see this firsthand, as many of my peers, don't want to share their maybe conservative views or moderate conservative views, even more so in a class, because they're afraid that the professor, traditionally, many of these professors on college campuses, social justice warriors, what have you, are very, very left-leaning. They're afraid that, they might have repercussions such as bad grades or ultimately be, scored down on an exam or something. So they're ultimately pandering towards the professor's ideology, which is extremely dangerous because it takes away from the diversity of thought, and which really is what makes a university rich in dialogue and conversation.
And I think what alarms many American taxpayers is that when it comes to publicly funded institutions, universities and colleges, this lack of dialogue, I mean, you're paying for that to happen. Finally, I can't let you leave without asking about a new report that just came out of Davidson College. And professors there, and I can't believe this one, are actually allowing students to choose their own grade. What? Zachary, is this nuts? Or?
I can't believe it either, but unfortunately, this is a trend. We've reported multiple times here at Campus Reform, just over and over again, that these professors are making safe spaces, trigger warnings, cry closets, Care Bear, all these types of things to make students feel more safe, more inclusive. My question to them is, what happens when you go into the real world, right? This Davidson College, for example, you choose your own grade. In the business world, do you choose your own, whether that be an assignment in the workplace? Do you choose your own job? Do you choose what you do in your job? No, you go for it every day, work hard at your job, and try to achieve the very best grade. This seems quite backwards, and this is not what college and universities are intended to be. They're intended to teach, to inform our youth, and to be honest, it's quite frightening that our next generation, largest voting bloc right now in our country, is ultimately being treated this way and isn't standing up and saying, look, this isn't right. And we need to put forth the best effort to receive the best grade.
Okay, Zachary Petrozo from Campus Reform. We always appreciate you staying on top of this. Thanks so much for your insights.
Thank you so much.
I know what you're probably saying. Not another story on the Russia investigation. But I have to share this latest news. A new poll shows Americans just want it all to end. 66% of voters questioned in a recent CNN poll say Special Counsel Robert Mueller should wrap up his investigation before the November midterm election. A majority of Democrats, 57%, and 72% of Republicans want the investigation to wrap up. 69% of independents agree it should end. Well, President Trump has often said this about the Robert Mueller Russia collusion investigation.
We get questions on the witch hunt, and I don't think the people out in the country buy it.
Why don't they buy it? Maybe because after a year and a half, the investigation has little to show for the $17 million spent. That's why former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort was arrested and sent to prison and tried for financial crimes, not Russian collusion. Collusion in itself is not a crime. The special counsel found nothing there, and so like most special counsels, Robert Mueller has to justify a year and a half of work by coming up with something, anything. In the CNN poll, 70% of the people said they think President Trump should testify before Robert Mueller. The president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, doesn't want the president to do an interview. Here's what those 70% may not understand about presidential testimony.
Why do you want to get him under oath? You think we're fools? You want to get him under oath because you want to trap him into perjury. Well, we're not going to let you do that.
The president's lawyers argue Trump cannot be compelled to testify against himself, and issuing a subpoena against a sitting president is unconstitutional. If Mueller issues one, a lengthy legal battle would likely end up before the U.S. Supreme Court.
You get a subpoena, you file what's called a motion to quash. We'll prepare to handle it in court.
CNN also found that 56% of those polled believe the president has attempted to interfere in the Russia investigation. I'm sure the 90% negative media coverage of the president influenced that opinion. Well, regardless, the president's ongoing statements declaring his innocence may not be helping him. Here's what Trump said after the Inspector General released his findings.
There was no collusion. There was no obstruction.
Mr. President, enough already. Americans get it. They've heard you repeatedly declare your innocence. Let the facts speak for themselves. Most Americans know the Russians tried to influence our presidential election, and yes, we've yet to see evidence that the Russians actually changed votes. But evidence does suggest possible collusion involving people at the highest levels of our Justice Department, FBI, and CIA. Special counsels never really seem to work well for America, but in this case, it may be time, as Senator Lindsey Graham and others have said, to investigate the investigators. We know that Peter Strzok, the former lead investigator for the Hillary Clinton email and Russia investigations, showed bias against Donald Trump. He was recently fired for violating FBI rules. Did other agents and officials connected to Hillary Clinton and the Democrats take steps to prematurely halt her investigation and influence the Russia probe? If Attorney General Jeff Sessions doesn't get to the bottom of it, then another special counsel needs to be appointed. Yes, a weary American public is unlikely to support another special counsel investigation, but did people at the highest levels of our government, like officials in some third world dictatorship, actually collude to use government personnel and resources against the ruling party's political opponents? The country deserves to know the truth about its intelligence agencies. Just before God's judgment brought destruction, exodus, and enslavement against Israel, the prophet Jeremiah warned them in chapter 7, verse 28. The truth has perished. It has vanished from their lips. Folks, let's keep pushing for godliness in government and in our own lives. Let's pray for leaders who stand against corruption and for righteousness, those whose lips speak truth. Well, that's it from the Global Lane. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, YouTube, SoundCloud, iTunes, and Twitter. And until next time, be blessed.